And this is our third and I expect final session on superstition and Judaism. And we'll cover a myriad of topics today in our hour that I hope you will find interesting. You might find a bit bizarre in some cases, but also something that explains a lot of things that we do in Jewish life today. Firstly, I hope everybody is well and managing in these interesting times as effectively as possible. So we're going to start off by focusing a little bit at the beginning on shadim, on demons, in terms of how they came to be and how our tradition understands. Primarily reflected in Midrash, and again, Midrash being rabbinic commentary on biblical verses, and basically using the biblical text as a jumping off point to formulate an idea. Midrash is a rather ancient form of rabbinic commentary. It, in many cases, parallels the creation of the Mishnah, the first rabbinic legal source, which will evolve in a few centuries into the Gemara, into the Talmud, which is an elaboration of the Mishnah. But Midrash is parallel. Midrash has two types. There's the Midrash that is Midrash Agadah, and is Midrash Halacha. Midrash Agadah is basically Midrash that deals with the narrative portions of biblical text, that basically tries to further develop theological understandings, interpretations of history, of events. And the Midrash we're going to look at in a moment will be one that is a Midrash Agadah, a narrative Midrash. A halachic Midrash is what it sounds like, a rabbinic interpretation of a biblical verse that determines halacha, that has legal ramifications. So Midrash is a rather serious body of literature, and there are large numbers of Midrash. It's pretty, it's a very extensive library of text, and some of it is really challenging, and some of it is can be fun, but it is a very, very important body of literature. So it parallels again Mishnah and Talmud, which is more legal focused, but also has a lot of material that goes beyond the law and deals with narrative as well. So let's go back to demons. So we are told that demons were part of God's creation of the world. That in the and we are told that demons were created on Friday afternoon, very close to the onset of Shabbat. So, as the Midrash describes it, Misha Amar v'haya ha'olam, the one who spoke and the world came into being. If you were on the minyan this morning, you heard the words Baruch she'amar v'haya olam, praise be he who spoke and the world came into being. It's one of the appellations for God, a very poetic appellation. And so God basically, hu haya osek b'vriyato shel olam, God was busying himself, or as one says now in a more egalitarian context, with God's self, and in the creation of the world. Vara nishmatan, he created the souls of the shadim, of the spirits, and uval livriot gufan, but it was time to create their bodies. The kadesh Shabbat v'lo v'ra'an, and Shabbat began, and there was no time to make the bodies. So that's why they were just spirits without bodies, and that became the form of the shadim, of the demons. Now, what we also find, which is interesting, I think, that there were basically different types of shadim. There were ones that were not necessarily evil, that were basically okay. They were not evil. They were benevolent spirits, and that would, in a sense, also understood to be the soul, the spirit that would survive the body after a death would take place. And that gives us the understanding that when one is officiating at a burial, or one is present at a burial, what is happening is that it is the physical body that is buried, and the spirit departs from the body at that point. And if the spirit is departing from the body of a good person, then the spirit is a benevolent force, a good force. But if it is from a person who is a rasha, a wicked person, that's what creates the demon being a negative figure that one should avoid at all costs. So most of the times we talk about shadim, though, we're focusing on the evil spirit. We're not focusing on the good spirit because they don't give us a big problem in life. We're not worrying about them per se. But as we'll see, there are things that we do in order to mollify or to satisfy the spirits to help us get along in life and to avoid and overcome challenge. So that is one of the whole idea of the creation, seeing that where they come from, it's part of God's creation, but the fact they are deficient because they don't have bodies, they just have souls or spirits, that means it's because of the onset of Shabbat. So Shabbat takes precedence over creation, and that creation, even God had to stop creating when his Shabbat began. And so that's why you have these half-formed beings that are only spirits. Again, at the outset, some of them could have been beneficent or good, but basically when we speak of shadim, we normally are referring to the ones that are malevolent or wicked or evil and potentially causing harm to us and being a destructive force in the universe. So one absolutely fascinating aspect, I alluded to this in the first session, is the connection between shadim, between spirits, evil spirits particularly, and uncleanliness. So, and there was a term for the evil spirits were often referred to the spirits of uncleanliness, and that is why our tradition was so concerned with and emphatic about netilat yadayim, about washing the hands, which becomes even ritualized in the Jewish context. As you all know, if you've been part of a traditional meal, a Suda, you know that the first thing we do before we make the motzi is netilat yadayim, a ritualized washing of the hands, which is accompanied by a bracha. And there are a lot of very observant Jews who begin the day with negelwasser, with washing their hands when they wake up. First thing they do before waking up, before even getting out of bed, there's water at the bedside on the floor. And if you see any of these Netflix films about the ultra-Orthodox community, you often see images of the netilat yadayim that takes place immediately upon awakening. In a sense, it's a rite of purification. So a lot of, again, connected with a lot of things, connected with, as we see, the eating of bread. And we feel that if you would eat with unwashed hands, you'd potentially be contaminating the food or anything else that you would be touching, and you would endanger others who might eat from the same food. And there were several occasions that were enumerated with the ritualized washing of the hands with netilat yadayim, which, by the way, the washing of the hands was destroying the demons or forcing them away from the situation. And so the various occasions were, as I mentioned, rising in the morning. There also was because during the nighttime, one could experience various dangers, which we hopefully will get to before the end of the session. And so on Yom Kippur, by the way, the many things we don't do, but we are still expected to wash hands in the morning. And the things that you would do that would cause harm had you not washed your hands are enumerated as the following: touching your eyes, your ears, your nose, and your mouth with unwashed hands. That would cause trouble. And it was feared that the evil spirits would enter the body through these orifices. Now, of course, to read this today is incredible, because you think you're reading this in this morning's newspaper, that all of the wearing of the mask and not touching your face is something that we're hearing all the time. one of the benefits of the mask is it prevents you from touching the parts of your face, although it doesn't cover your eyes. And those of us who habitually cover our face, we know we have to wash hands very frequently and sing Dayenu 3 times when you're washing your hands to make sure you do it long enough. But this is something that is very much connected to modern science. We may not say that we are evicting the demons from our life by washing our hands, but what we are doing is preventing the intake of a dangerous virus, which again can be very easily connected to the concept of a demon, something that threatens your life and your well-being and that could cause great harm. And also the idea that you're washing your hands prevents your passing on that evil spirit, or in today's terminology, that virus, to other people. So it's one thing, you can harm yourself, but you can also be harming other people. So quite incredible, the relevance of something that we could think of we're reading in this morning's paper, which of course is something that we would find in texts that are 800 years old. So I think I saw a question, so I'm going to just look and see for a moment if there's any question that I did see. I think, John, you raised a virtual, I don't know if that was deliberate or not, you raised a virtual hand. Did you have a question, John?
Yes, it looks like there's a difference between a physical uncleanliness and a emotional or like anti-kavana, not in the right state of mind. Would this be more like a way of mentally kind of getting you set up for the day and there's the physical impurity, spiritual impurity.
Okay, I think basically the discussion here is primarily physical, concrete. I don't think it was specifically an emotional impurity. It was very concrete. In other words, this could physically harm you, could cause, it could ultimately lead to death or something, a very real destructive force. I don't think it's as much devoted to something spiritual or emotional as it is something that is a physical danger. Again, very parallel to the idea of virus and that's so much part of our rhetoric today. There is I'm just looking to see if any hands waving. Okay, so we'll have many pauses for questions. The other fascinating, interesting discussion is that there were times where people would be in a home and they would have a series of unfortunate events take place in that home. And it was sometimes and felt that it was not possible in order to just find a ritualized way of ridding the spirits that were causing those unfortunate events. And it was assumed that there would be some kind of misfortune that was causing it. So one of the suggestion in that case was, you got to move far away. You got to move, or you got to flee the demons. And by the way, it's even to this day there are times where unfortunately when things happen in a particular home, let's say you move to a new house and there's a series of unfortunate events where people say that there's something lurking in that home, and some of the classical sources argued that fasting and prayer, the normal things that would work, sometimes won't be effective, that you just got to get away from there because you're in a place of danger. That and there were even the idea that there was an idea expressed that you shouldn't build a home in uncharted territory. In other words, you should only build where there are already other people who are living. Don't go to some far off place where nobody is living and build your home. And if you do so, don't build it out of stone, because evidently that was felt to be a place that then you would have a lot of ongoing tsuris in terms of survival, in terms of escaping danger. I'm not really sure why stone versus wood, probably because it's a permanent structure, and it would whereas wood is less of a permanent structure. But nonetheless, the idea was that it's not a good idea to build in the middle of nowhere, that would be a good question to discuss with real estate agents as well. Okay, Mel, I see you. I'm unmuting you. Mel.
Yes. What about the mezuzah on the door, which is supposed to uh, take evil spirits away, protect us from evil spirits?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I haven't really focused a lot on amulets, which again, and that would be viewing the mezuzah as an amulet, as a protective device. Of course, the Torah, when commanding the mezuzah, which is not, it's not speaking about the part that you buy in the gift shop, but the scroll that you're putting on your doorpost, which we read, twice a day in the Shema, and we read of the mitzvah of putting the, verses of the Torah. And the idea there is basically just because God wants those words to be around, just like they're on the tefillin. God wants those to be, adorning your home. The idea of it being a protective device is a later notion. It's not biblical. It becomes, there really isn't, I think I've mentioned, there really isn't much instance at all of superstition in the Torah or in the Tanakh. It all comes later, and the Middle Ages is a major feeding time for such superstition. Whereas, and then people even today will say will view them as a protective amulet, safeguarding the well-being of those in the house. I struggle with that concept. I'm not really comfortable with it, especially when there are people who will say when somebody is struck with severe illness, in particular if a child, God forbid, is struck with severe illness, the remedy is to check the mezuzahs in the house to make sure they're still kosher. I really struggle with that because I would have trouble believing in a God that would punish a child because the mezuzah, was not kosher. I think it's I don't really push too much faith in that belief. I think we should have kosher mezuzah. I think we should have mezuzot. It's wonderful they should be kosher. We have to periodically remember to check them. But I don't really view that we would be punished, with a mortal illness, were we to fall short of that requirement. So it could be, if one wants to view it as a source of protection, I think that's fine. But I wouldn't say that one should guilt those who are suffering by saying it's your fault that you're suffering because you got a kosher mezuzah, there'd be no illness in your house. You have to be very careful how that's applied, but it's definitely there in terms of thought even today. And there are certain very prominent movements in Judaism today that make a point of going around to tell you, make sure your mezuzah is kosher to protect yourself and your family from illness, which again, I do struggle with. I do see some waving hands, so I'll go down the Hollywood squares. Okay, Barbara?
Does the golem fit into this realm of superstition?
Well, I mean, I guess one could. I'm not sure. It's not really. The idea is like it's like the Jewish Frankenstein. The idea coming out of this super being that is to protect the Jews.
Yeah.
It's not coming out. It's not a deeply scientific concept. I'm not sure though that I would put it in the category of superstition. It's kind of in its own category it's interesting. If you a good subject for a discussion, which I'm really not prepared to do today because I have to do a lot of preparation. But there've been articles recently and in the past about the Jewish involvement in creating Superman and Spider-Man and all of these superheroes. They came from Jewish writers. I mean, they were the idea in a sense that it was kind of a hope that we could find a way, a fantasy of having these super beings that were going to protect us. Of course, it became popularized in general culture and doesn't have much Jewish connectivity today. But the writers, like the creators of Superman and Spider-Man, and many of these other superheroes were Jewish. The idea again, but I'm not sure that really connects to superstition. It's more sort of fantasizing a way of overcoming our enemies, especially at a time when our enemies were really causing us great harm. I mean, a lot of this comes out of the World War II period and thereafter. And so it's the connection is pretty obvious. But it's an interesting point, and that would be a good subject for a talk by someone who is expert in that, or maybe someone who could become expert. I would have a lot of work to do in order to go to do that. But there are books that have come out on the origin of these superheroes, and again, and the strong Jewish connection to those who created them. I saw another waving hand. Otherwise, there'll be more opportunity. I'm just looking at the book. Oh, okay. Ruth will be with you in a second. Okay, we'll go back to Ruth. Okay, and then Ruth. Okay. Ruth?
Hi, Rabbi.
Hi.
I just have to go back to the question of the mezuzah. How
Mhm.
about if a mezuzah is accidentally removed from a house or a building? My husband just relocated his business into what was previously a shoe store, and the shoe store owner was a Jewish man. He had a beautiful mezuzah. And unfortunately, in the months of the relocation and the demolitions and the different crews that were in and out, my husband doesn't know what happened, but it's not there anymore, and it appears it must have been torn away or taken off. So I'm the superstitious one of the two, and he was a little worried, but I was very worried, and I said, is it going to be bad luck when the mezuzah is removed from a house? And that's what Albert told us. Albert didn't remove his mezuzah because he said it's bad luck. We don't remove a mezuzah from a house.
Well,
Anyway,
the remedy is really easy. Put up another one, replace it.
yeah, okay.
And then whether, so if there's going to be temporary harm, which I'm not sure there would be, but were there to be temporary harm, you could protect yourself by putting up a new mezuzah or another mezuzah. There's the old joke told about the builder who's, they build condominiums, and it's a Jewish area, and they put mezuzot up on every unit. And so the guy says, okay, thank you. The workman who did it mentions to the builder, so I completed the task, but he said, I took all the warranties out. And it just, there were all these warranties, and I took them out and I just put up so that's not recommended. Okay, Mel?
Yeah, what surprises me, Rabbi, just by that statement, I did a little research work, and it says Jews were to admonish superstition. One should not believe in superstition, but it is best to be heedful of them. Another one, you must not practice superstition. Thou shalt not be found among you soothsayers and enchanters. And yet we're talking about superstitions as part of the Jewish culture.
Mm-hmm. There is a tremendous amount of inconsistency in our tradition. And my late teacher, Professor Max Kaduche, Alav Shalom, he created a term that was indeterminacy of belief. In other words, there's no certainty in what a belief is, because you can find a belief in Jewish tradition and then the opposite belief at the same time. And we looked the first week at some of the texts and tractate Shabbat that deal with astrology, and there are those who felt it was very serious and very much a part of life and took it seriously. And there were those who said, Ein Mazal B'Yisrael, which doesn't mean you don't have your luck. It means there's no constant. We don't believe in this stuff. This stuff is Irish. So you have opposite points of view that exist. So I think that's not something that we're unfamiliar with. I think we're pretty well used to the idea of having some conflict. I want to go on a bit because there's some stuff I still want to cover. That there was a lot of focus in the literature on the dangers that lurk at night. Again, that's one of the reasons for the Negelwasser, for washing your hands upon awakening, because things can happen to you at night, and all kinds of evil spirits lurk around night. So these are some rules that were promulgated because of that you shouldn't drink a liquid that was standing overnight. You don't drink from a well at night. I know that's not something that a lot of us do, but because that's the time that the evil spirits would come out. And you shouldn't place food under a bed for safekeeping during the night. I mean, if you feel you're going to have this uncontrollable urge to have a snack at 3 a.m. and you don't want to have to get out of bed to go to the kitchen, you want to just reach under the bed and pull out the bowl of popcorn. Not a good idea, because again, evil spirits can contaminate it overnight. So you shouldn't. And also, this is very important to keep in mind, especially when people are doing all this cooking during this kind of situation we're enduring right now, that garlic or onions or eggs, which have been peeled and left overnight, cannot be eaten. That's a piece of advice that, in other words, that could be something that you would be, because they could be infused with a demonic spirit over the night. And so don't peel them the day before and then use them next day. Peel them when you want them. Okay, that's something I think all those our cooks should keep in mind. There's something that's kind of weird, but it's interesting. The Maharil, who was a prominent halachic authority, Rabbi Yaakov Molin, who died in 1425. We don't know when he was born, but let's say it was, so he's, basically mid 14th to early 15th century, and a very important authority. He said that a person, in his text, it's a man, who should not spend the night alone in his bedchamber. In other words, that he needs protection and needs to be somebody else. And then it says he himself used to keep a boy beside him at night. That doesn't resonate too well today. And so I'm not sure. I think one has to be a little cautious with that example. But you also should not be at night walking without a light with you, because again, you're endangering yourself. And I think in a way that would be part of common sense as well, that we don't want to do that, because it could be something that would be dangerous. So I want to focus for a few moments on something that we talked about the first week, and there were questions about it, and that's the idea of the ayin hara, the evil eye, because someone asked me about the phrase kanein hara, which is kain ayin hara, bli ayin hara, with the evil eye. And this was the idea that we were concerned that somebody could basically cast a spell on you and cause harm were you to achieve too much success. So in a way, it's a rather poor statement in terms of about humanity. In other words, it doesn't reflect well on our attitude about other people, that people would want to harm us in our good fortune. But there were several things that people would do as a result, because there was fear of that. And some of them are known and some are less known. And one which is interesting, which I found fascinating, is that if someone had a very beautiful baby, if a baby was really like a really good-looking baby, there were those who would give that baby an ugly name to defer the ayin hara, so people would not be envious. And Rashi comments, and this is a bit embarrassing, but I have to, this is going back, 800 years more, and 900 years. And, but he does say that he gives an example that you'd call your son Ethiop, that he's Ethiopian, which kind of may reflect on the skin color, which would consider to be a disparaging name. Again, I would be very cautious about teaching that in a wide circle today, because it's something we don't want to promulgate that as being a Jewish value. But it was an idea, again, to deflect from the beauty of this child. And again, I don't recommend when people ask me questions about naming, and I had two this past week, people ask me questions about names. I rarely say, I don't ask the question, how's a beautiful baby? Of course it's a beautiful baby. So let's think of some ugly names that you could use. I don't offer that advice. I probably would not have survived 39 years in one congregation had I been known to offer that advice. But at some point that was a superstition, again, also to confuse the evil spirits, because they're going to look when too much goodness is happening. Things are too good. They have to somehow get involved and get busy. They get motivated to strike. So, and there were various examples of things that were done when, at a real moment of nachas, in order to to prevent the casting of the ayin hara, and the concomitant invasion of the shadim of the evil spirits. There was this: if you were leading your child to school for the first time, and that's a nachas moment when your child is going to school. It's the first stage of childhood, a very important stage of childhood, and the father would evidently cover the child with a cloak, with some kind of garment, to hide the child, so that nobody would cast the evil eye on him. And that is also, I mentioned before, and you probably know this, that the reason why family members were not going to be consecutive in getting Torah honors, because that's already too much nachas in one family. And that's also why double weddings were discouraged. Again, you don't want to overdo the nachas piece, because then people would be tempted to cast the evil eye on you. So we read examples of how people who were prominent or extremely attractive, who would attract special attention, were considered vulnerable to the ayin hara, to the evil eye. But the remedy was very simple. You just have to veil the beauty, and you shouldn't be too ostentatious about displaying your riches. You keep it sort of subtle and a little bit covered. And the idea of covering the child or never giving the child an unattractive name were ways of kind of trying to defeat this evil eye. So obviously what's interesting is not that we're going to do most of this stuff today. The only thing that we still do with that whole list is not have consecutive family aliyot. But most of the stuff we don't, we're not giving the ugly names. We're not hiding the child when taking him to school. We're not doing most of this stuff because we're not as concerned about the ayin hara as people once were. But that really was a major fear. That really, and again, the expression became part of culture. Knei nahara is part of Yiddish vernacular. Or in Israel, bli ayin hara. I mean, it doesn't mean that the person saying that is by definition superstitious, but it's part of the language because it was so deeply. You were worried. You were afraid to reflect too much goodness and how much nachas you're having, because it could lead to things that would be very destructive in the end result. So again, we're less worried about this today. Again, we're not giving the ugly. I hope we're not giving the ugly names. I had this situation where people sometimes Yiddish doesn't translate well into Hebrew. Often it does, but there was a Russian name, I believe. It wasn't pure Yiddish. It was a Russian name that was often used in Yiddish circles for a woman, and that was Russia. I want to name my child Russia. Well, so the only problem with that's an interesting Hebrew name, but it means a wicked person in Hebrew. Not the greatest idea to use that as the name. It's almost like today when somebody I want to name my son after the Zayda Olav Shalom. So what was the Zayda's name? Loser. And of course, Loser is the Yiddishized version of Eliezer, which is a beautiful biblical name. But in Anglo-Saxon culture, in countries, to have a child with the name Loser is not necessarily a gift to that child. I mean, that would almost go in the category of an unattractive name. Hi, Loser. So sometimes you don't recommend it unless you want to say, okay, stick to the Hebrew pronunciation, forget the Yiddish pronunciation, Elazar or Eliezer, and you're good. But people says are very insistent that it has to be the way the Zayda was called, the way the name was pronounced. You don't want Eliezer, you want Loser. And I get the argument if I'm sadly at a time of death when we're getting the Hebrew name and making the mole, and we will use the Hebrew pronunciation, and we get in trouble if it's not exactly the way they remember the name being recited. But it's not always, we want to just kind of do it in the proper Hebrew pronunciation and not the Yiddishized version, which is more of a slang. When you use a formal name, for example, you normally will say Thomas, not Tommy, Joseph, not Joey. So there's a distinction between the vernacular, the name that's used in common speech, and the formal name that you want to remember. But sometimes you use both, which is if person really wants the Joey, you say Joseph and you say Joey, and they do it in memorial announcements. We'll have Joey in brackets. To say you want to recall the name by which the person was known. But we see the time, when we use names, sometimes inadvertently, we could be giving that unattractive name that we don't necessarily want to do because of the way it reads in the culture in which we're living. I'm not going to say this word now because this is not an X-rated Zoom. But there's certain words that in Yiddish, for example, that you can't really say because they mean something else in English, and you can't really use the Yiddish word for fan in a public context, because I'm not going to say what it is, but you can use your imagination. It doesn't read well in English. Let's put it that way. So okay, let's move on. I'm looking to see if we have any wild. Okay, now. Dr. Kraft is not here today because I don't think it's Stephen here, because I'm going to do something this is something about eyes, about vision, and he's obviously one of the world's leading authorities on vision. So I'll have to, I'll get back. Give me Mel. I'll get you in 2 minutes. Okay. I see you. I'll get you in 2. Oh yeah, Mel's here. Mel is okay. Yeah, Mel. I'm sorry. Yeah, Dr. Mel Katzman is on, an optometrist. So we do have an eye specialist here. So sorry. Now, one of okay, so we're told that there are things that ritualized were done in order to benefit vision, because where people always, there's always been a fear throughout history and today about, especially when one gets older, of losing vision, or there are various maladies that one can confront that can affect one's vision. And so there was a belief that one of the preemptive methods of preserving vision was through the wine of Kaduche. So so the simpler version of that was the very idea when you would make the Kaduche on Friday night. It had a means of enhancing one's vision. And how that originates, it's hard to say, but there is even a minhag in some communities of bathing the eyelids with Kiddush wine. And so Kiddush wine was viewed to be a remedy for weakness of vision. Mel, I don't know if you've confronted that in your practice, and I'm saying no, but that was considered to be a connection. And so, and by the way, evidently this concept exists in other cultures as well. The idea of wine having medicinal benefit in terms of any kind of vision issue, and fascinating. There was the idea that really the wine that's really going to have great medicinal value would be with a wine that is used at a brit. The wine that is at a bris. It has the three things that happen to it. One is that it's used to soothe the baby. So you take a gauze pad, you put it in the wine, and you stick it, and the baby sucks on it, and it kind of is soothing. Also, at the end of the brit, when you make a mishaberach for the mother and the baby, the mother is supposed to drink the wine, some of the wine also, as a protection for her. As well, and of course the wine is used at the time that we're naming the baby. So there's a lot of, so that one, if there's any leftover wine that the baby hasn't drunk too much of it and the mother didn't take too much of it, that would also be seen to be something you could take and put on your eyes. It would be great to enhance your vision. The Mohalim don't advocate that because it would create many problems, and especially in these days we're a little concerned about using one thing for too many purposes. But there was the idea of the wine of Kaduche having medicinal value, which is certainly fascinating. Again, all this has origin, and there's no scientific proof of this happening, but it was a folk belief that became very prevalent. And if you ever want to read the book by by Trachtenberg, Joshua Trachtenberg, going back to 1937 on superstition, he has a whole chapter on medicine and superstition, and that was just one example of very many. So another issue that, as we age, we can sometimes become a bit forgetful. Some of us have experienced that, I have this happen. I've had this happen 30 years ago, since it's not just older age, but I could, come out of my office in the shul and walk into the general office for a purpose. I get into the general office and I have no idea what I came for. And I see some people smiling and laughing, because I guess you've experienced this in life too, where, and someone said, do you remember what happened, 30 years ago, we had a conversation. I don't know if you remember that conversation. So I said, well, I don't remember what I talked about last Thursday. So memory is something that does concern us. And so there are various remedies that were given to enhance one's memory. And so first of all, there were all kinds of things that we're told that, that are Talmudic, that can induce forgetfulness, things that will cause us to forget other things. And so these are some examples. So you want to avoid this. Eating what has been nibbled on by a mouse or a cat. I'm not usually tempted to do that. Eating an animal's heart. This one's a tough one. Eating olives. Interesting. Drinking water in which somebody has washed. Again, that's not something that, I don't think that's a great desire to do that. So I think that one would probably avoid that for other reasons, but according to Talmudic tradition, that can make you forget. Using one's garment as a pillow. Like, don't use your coat as a pillow, because that could lead you to forget. Why? Again, there's no scientific evidence that is offered to suggest why this was promulgated, but there were various things that were. So we have examples. We have examples that the Maharil, who I've already referred to, and also Mayor of Rothenburg and other really prominent sages of the Middle Ages, they avoided sleeping on their clothes. I guess it was something probably when people were poor. You didn't have pillows. You didn't, you couldn't go to bed, Bath and Beyond, and buy a beautiful pillow. You had to see something. You took your coat, and you made a pillow out of it. So that they would avoid doing that, and they were discouraging that practice. We're told in the Maharil when he would travel. Remember that thing he used to do when you would go from one place to another. And a few months ago, which we forgot about already. When you would be on a journey, he would prefer a hard saddle under his head rather than a soft bundle of his garments. You can't, so he would get to use his saddle as a pillow, which would be uncomfortable. That was preferable to using clothing, which could endanger your memory. And today there's taking us into the 20th century, there is a minhag amongst certain Hasidic communities of men who avoid passing between two women. And not only because they don't want to be near women altogether, but in this case, they felt that could be harmful to your memory if you're passing between two women. I'm not so sure why. That is an interesting, interesting concept. So other fascinating piece of thing that could affect memory is wiping one's hands on one's clothing. And if you've ever, excuse me for getting graphic, but if you've ever been in a public restroom where they have the electronic blowers, so the old joke was the instruction on how to use that is you put your hands under the electronic blower and then you wipe your clothes on your hands on your pants, because it would never, it wouldn't usually do a good drop of drying. Some of the new dryers are very good and you almost can't get your hand out there, so strong. But overall, that was it's a no-no though, according to medieval Jewish superstition, that if you wipe your hands on your clothing, you could lose memory. Putting on two garments at a time. I'm not quite sure how that would work. I need to see the video of that. I need to see the YouTube of putting on two garments at one time, which I don't think people do too often because they can't do it, but if they could lose memory. And this is also something that most people don't do, but I guess it's been known to be done in history, that if you should never be mending clothing when you're naked. I can think of other reasons not to do that, but it's not, that could affect your memory as well. There were certain practices that developed, if there were certain actions that were considered to affect one's memory, there were things you could do to preempt that. And the Eastern European Jews had a minhag, a German minhag, of keeping a bit of thread in the mouth when they were mending garments that are on the body. In other words, if you were doing it to protect you from, if you were mending a garment that you were wearing, while you're wearing it, you put a thread in your mouth. That was a protection. Otherwise, you could, so that was considered to be to have an impact upon memory as well. So, and I think one of the fears that we've, throughout history that we've had is about, the challenge of forgetting and of not having the same memory skills that one would have as a younger person, and what could be causing that. And there's, by the way, there was a superstition about not reading. This is really interesting. About not reading the inscription on a matzeva, on a tombstone. There was this, and it's evidently still practiced in some quarters. You don't read the inscription, but there is a remedy. So let's say you really want to read the inscription. What you do to prevent the ill effects of reading the inscription would be to place a stone on the monument. And it's one of the most, that's never one of the reasons you give. Why do you place a stone on a matzeva? The normal reason that one gives today is, well, first of all, you're building onto the matzeva, you're adding, because the original monument was a pile of stones, you're adding a stone, you're building on, it's an act of tribute to the departed, you're building onto the memory. It's also a calling card to show the person's been visited. It's a reflection of honor, the person's been visited, not forgotten. But what may be the case is this may have originated with superstition. It may have been the idea that you felt there was something dangerous about reading the inscription. And why, it's hard to explain why that would be considered to be dangerous, but the way of avoiding that, the consequences of that act was to place a stone. It was a sense that was the remedy. It's like putting the thread in your mouth when you're doing a repair while you're wearing a garment. That was going to protect you from any harm. This would be a harm from reading. If you want to read them, let's say, if you want to read the inscription. So that's one of the explanations. Maybe it's one of the oldest explanations for placing the stone. Although I don't think so, because the idea of the monument being a pile of stones is already biblical. Okay, so let me take another question, pause, and see if there are any hands up, either electronic or virtual. 1 second. Okay, Brenda, 1 second. Brenda?
Yeah,
And then Mel, 1 second.
I had a question that you alluded to earlier, that when someone dies, their spirit departs from their soul. And I've heard, and I believe that somewhat, that if that spirit, it could be imbued in someone else who's living, like a child or a grandchild.
Well, there was a belief, not a widespread belief, not a normative belief in Judaism, but there was this thing called the transmigration of souls, that the soul would depart from one and enter another person. And there were those who believed that happening, but it never became a major aspect of Jewish theology. In other words, it's kind of a side belief. It's not one that ever really had great currency in larger circles, but it was out there. Mel?
Yes. One, I have two of the superstitions. The veiling of the bride, is that not a superstition?
Well, no, that's excellent, Mel, because basically it would, you're kind of hiding her beauty. In other words, that's the idea, you're hiding, and because if otherwise she would look, people would be envious if she's too beautiful, so you're not allowing her to be seen, so that you're hiding her. But it's like hiding the child when you're taking him to school. You're concealing the beauty of the bride, and not every bride, according to the Bet Hillel, is beautiful. And so any bride, you're hiding the face so that you're not giving the ayin hara. You don't worry as much about the groom in that case, but it's the bride that we don't want people to be too envious of this beautiful color, and so you're kind of concealing her face. And that may be, I'm not sure what the explanation in terms of Islamic policy, but it may be similar as well. Did you something else, Melly, you wanted to?
The other one is that you're talking about an optometrist. I haven't seen anybody that's gone blind from the Kohanim doing the blessing and looking at them. So that's a superstition also.
Yeah, well, that's true. And there's the story told about that the father warns his child not to look at the Kohanim when they're duchening, because first time you do it, you're going to go blind. If you do it again, you die. And so the son says, well, if I'm blind, how can I do it a second time? But that's, again, there are better ways of saying, the reason why you don't look at the Kohanim, by the way, there is a reason for it, because you don't want to distract them. You don't want to distract them from their, because if you make eye contact, it could distract the Kohen, nothing to do with your vision. And there you go, Mel. You're one of the good ones. You're one of the champions of Birkat Kohanim. I'm just taking a look. I see that there are Naomi mentions in chat that of having seen people approach the Kiddush cup after Havdalah and putting a drop of wine on the eyelids, and I suspect that originates, from the idea that it was a protection, that it was good for your vision. So there was a connection why it was the eye, because specifically connecting it to vision, well, Alan interestingly posed the question on chat about when we talked about the the spirit, the shadim not being fully created before Shabbat would interrupt creation, I would suspect that, why didn't God leave time for the full embodiment of the spirits? Probably was deliberate. It probably was deliberate. Sometimes you want to, when you want to avoid something, you wait till the time passes, you push it off. I imagine that if God really wanted the shading to have a full being, to have a physical being as well as a spiritual being, that he would have started a bit earlier. It's certainly an interesting question. So let's, I want to just get to let's go through a couple of other things, and before we reach the end of our time, on Simchat Torah, we complete the reading of Deuteronomy, we complete the reading of the Torah, and then we immediately start reading Genesis. We immediately start reading Bereshit. And we go right from one, we do a bit of singing in between, but evidently there were times where you wouldn't even do that. You would just go continuing right from one to the other, because there was a concept that as long as Israel is studying the Torah, if one is reading the Torah through the study, Satan can't intervene. There can be no evil intervention. And so you don't want to have a pause, and you immediately restart the reading of the Torah. You don't wait till the next Shabbat to start it, but you immediately restart the reading of Torah to not give to Satan, or not give the evil spirits any kind of entree when there's that opening. And we're told that there was a certain Reb Benjamin in Talmudic times who the Shadim wanted to get, for some reason. He was on their list. He was on their hit list, but they could never get him because he was always studying Torah. And there was no once they were waiting to stop studying Torah so we can intervene, and they never had that opportunity because he was constantly studying. Parallel to that, not really dealing per se with, well, maybe one can connect it to superstition, was the story of the sage who was dying and suffering in a very difficult end of life circumstance. And you had all his Talmidim, all the students were davening, kind of saying Tehillim, they were praying constantly. And the maid of the household wanted them to stop because she wanted her master to be able to leave this world and for his suffering to end. So she took a glass or a vase, dropped it, a loud bang, and they all stopped for a second, and he died at that second. And evidently the maid was praised by the sages for that act. In a sense, it was, that the idea that the person was being sustained, the sage was being sustained by the constant prayer, but that it was enough already. There was the continuing of the suffering was considered to be terrible. And it was also the idea that one wants to prolong life, but not necessarily to prolong dying. And when you've crossed that bridge, at some point you want to allow that relief to take place. So the idea again of the interruption leading to something. But in this case, when we talk about the reading of Torah, and this Rabbi Benjamin, who was always learning, the idea being then that the interruption would be a negative force, because you wanted the continuation of learning, you want the continuation of reading Torah, you don't want that ever to be interrupted, and that is, so then you don't want the interruption. A couple of other, brief, as we conclude, a couple of brief comments that pertain to practices that we do. Something that is, certainly under this category of topic is a ritual that we do, and I don't know what's going to happen this year. But with Tashlich on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, the second day this year will be the second day because the first day is Shabbat. And when you basically symbolically you're casting, or you're taking bread, you're throwing it into a stream, and you're casting off your sins through that action. So many view this, including the Maharil, who we referred to a few times today, as what you're doing there is you're feeding the evil spirits that lurk in the stream, so they're going to leave you alone. In other words, that's part of the action. It's not simply the act of transferring your sins to breadcrumbs, but you're actually literally feeding the demons by throwing the bread in there, and you want to you want to take them away from you when you want to distract them. And so it's sort of a safety valve as well. In terms of, we talked about the wine of Kaduche. There's also discussion of the the wine of at the Pesach Seder, that we do one of the two aspects. One, of course, is that we have the kosher Eliyahu, and we open the door for him to come in, and this is an offering, whereas the wine of son is given as an offering to an evil spirit to keep them away from you. This is an offer to a good spirit, the spirit of Eliyahu, that supposedly enters the house. But we also have the minhag, which originates as a German custom, but has become pretty widespread now, where we take a drop of wine when we enumerate the 10 plagues. And this is seen, that the dropping of the blood is an offering to the spirits. That's how it's understood in its origin, but it's obviously something that's become part of our minhag today, part of our custom, where we're not thinking of evil spirits, but that may be its point of origin as well. Wine of Havdalah also. We have a beautiful gathering every Havdalah, even in these circumstances. And there was also a minhag in some communities, a custom of taking some of the Havdalah wine and spilling it on the ground as a sign, as a good omen for the week. But also, every time you have pouring out of wine, it is considered to be an offering that you're giving to the shadim, to the evil spirits. And even though, again, the practice may continue to exist, but we don't see the same end result. We're not seeing it as an offering to the shadim, to the spirits. In other words, to keep them at bay, to give them something so they leave us alone. But it's considered, in itself, to have its own purpose. I'm not that familiar with people today who are spilling wine on the floor, but it was seen as a good sign for the week. In other words, wine can symbolize prosperity, simcha. In simcha ela b'yayin, there's no joy except in wine, the Talmud tells us. So the idea of trying to bring that into the coming week, although people, we don't want to spill wine in the beautiful chapel in the shul or in your homes when you're making Havdalah. So I'm not sure that's going to become a popular practice again. But there are a lot of ideas, wine connected with a lot of aspects of life, that wine is present in this. In particular, wine is a symbol that is present in joyous aspects of Jewish life, whether it's weddings, whether it's bris, of course, and Shabbat and Yom Tov. It's part of celebration. It's part of simcha. And again, as I said, the Talmud tells us that wine is intrinsic to simcha. So, and that's why, by the way, you traditionally don't drink wine at a shiva house. You can have schnapps, you can have like vodka, you can have liquor, but because wine is so connected to simcha, it's considered to be inappropriate at a house of shiva. But so that's that's something, again, that is deep connection here, because simcha is always an open invitation for evil spirits to intervene, and therefore sometimes you'll be pouring out some wine to give them an offering so they leave you alone. And part of the many other things we do in our practice in times of avoiding simcha. Okay, so I am done. I'm going to let's take some parting questions. Marion, Marion.
Yes, when you talked about two people in the same family not getting an aliyah, it brought to mind that when we have a bar mitzvah, there can be two children in the same family. They can be twins, or a whole family will participate. Isn't that a simcha? I mean,
well, if it, again, understand that this is minhag, not halacha, so it's not hard and fast. But we often have these days, more often than Shabbat, than communal celebration, we have private celebration of bar and bat mitzvah, where it's a family service, where it's not part of the regular congregation. And this wouldn't apply because everybody's family there, so it doesn't really matter. But when it's the community, when you're talking about like a regular Shabbat morning, for example, in shul, where it's a community, it's not a exclusive family simcha, we still don't put siblings consecutive if we can avoid it. It's much on a Shabbat. It's much easier because you have 7 aliyot, and you can add additional aliyot, so you can separate family members. Harder during the week. But most times when we have a bar mitzvah during the week, thankfully, it's a private service. So again, it's all one family. So everyone is going to be family. So you're not worried about the iron harvest. You're already, but we still pretty well maintain where we can on a Shabbat, on a communal service, the separation of immediate family members. It's primarily, traditionally it was father and son because women didn't have aliyah, but we also would normally not you don't want to put too much family together, and that originates clearly in the superstition of the Ayin Hara, the Kaneno Hara syndrome. So again, it's not hard and fast.
Only one of my sisters, one of us, if we have yahrzeit, only one of us will get an aliyah that morning, because I guess that's the reason.
No, that's not the, well, that's the reason, because you only have 3, and we have other people who have to have them. There's no normally what Michael will try to do, whoever is controlling it, is to be fair to to divvy up to other people who have obligations, but to try to give somebody different services something to do. But we don't. That's not out of superstition per se, but we tend not. We do prefer not. We don't give consecutive siblings for that. You're right, for that would be the reason, but it's also there's a practical reason as well. So we normally have one person designated the honors, somebody else will open the ark. We give different chores to different people, and we flip them around. And sometimes it's an easy decision. Sometimes you have one person in the family will read from the Torah. I mean, the different things that we do to try to get everyone involved, but we do try not to have, and that's something that's really that's deeply rooted in Jewish custom, even though it's not a severe matter of law. In other words, it could be done, but the preference is not to do it. So that way, again, it wasn't what our sages envisioned, because our sages never envisioned daughters having aliyot. That was something that's modern to even Beth David. It's 20-year history. It's not 100-year history, and it's maybe in the whole Jewish world it's 40-year history or 50-year history. It's not something that has been. I mean, the first bat mitzvah was 75 years old now, but 90 years ago, the daughter of Mordechai Kaplan. But even then, it wasn't. I'm not sure what her level of participation was at her bat mitzvah in 1920, whenever it was. Okay, Adele. Thank you, Mary and Adele.
You're muted.
Can you tell me, please, the significance of the Humza?
I'm not, it's an amulet. Again, it's one of these of Sephardic origin. I don't know a lot about it, to be honest. I don't really have a good answer. I'm going to have to Google it, and I'm sure you'll find something in Wikipedia. I don't have but it's an amulet. I haven't done a lot of studying about amulets. It's something that was just like a protective charm. That why it's that design is it's a pretty old Sephardic minhag, very big in the Sephardic. And by the way, amulets are very big in Sephardic culture, much more so than Ashkenazi culture. There were certainly Sephardic rabbis running for election that would hand to all the people amulets, like as a to get them to vote for the right party. But it was also, it's considered, doesn't resonate as nearly as much in the Ashkenazi community. I don't know a lot about the Humza, though, to be honest, of why that was chosen. I mean, that would be something that we can all Google and find out the answer to. Let me looking for any other hands. We have another minute. Well, we've already gone over, but okay. Marlene, 1 second. Hi, Marlene. Okay. Okay, don't you unmute yourself. I have to unmute you. So I'm not able, for some reason I can't unmute you. Okay.
Okay. Hi. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the in ha'ora. When you want to make sure that you don't do say something about a new baby or mazel tov to somebody to take away the good things. A lot of these people end up wearing like a red ribbon on their wrist.
We talked about it in previous sessions. That was, also considered to be an amulet. But probably goes, the earliest idea of that was taking a string, wrapping around the grave of a tzaddik, and then putting that around the body. It was often around the neck, not the arm, as a sign of protection. It's considered to be. It's also called a magic circle. And since you create that circle, it's protection from the evil spirit. Why red and not? I don't really have a great answer for why red and not blue. But the idea of taking a string creating a protective circle was something that was deeply rooted in our tradition. So at this point, I'm going to give Mel the last word, and then I'm going to unmute all of you. Mel.
Yeah, in parallel to throwing the bread in the stream, how about clubbing kapuvas with the chicken?
Same idea, transferring the sins to the 100%. The same category, the idea of kaparot, when you were basically putting your sins on the land. And then the Torah there intimates that when you have the Sir Lazazel, the scapegoat, symbolically carried our sins. But that was understood to be an act of symbolism, whereas often in the Middle Ages that became something that was considered real. You really were taking your sins, whereas in the Torah it's symbolic. The Torah, in a sense, is more modern here than the Middle Ages. The Torah viewed it as symbolic. You symbolically can, but they didn't really believe that you were putting your sins in the goat. But whereas in the Middle Ages, with the chicken, you're considering that you're putting you're taka putting the sins into the chicken. So don't eat that chicken. It could be harmful to your health. So I've unmuted all of you. I want to thank all of you for your diligence. So next Tuesday, I'm going to just do some pre-Shavuot for learning, some Torah study, days before Shavuot. And what we do after that, I will think about will to be announced in the coming weeks. We have, by the way, just as an announcement, we have we're going to be linked on the Shul media to 2 tikkunim prior to Shavuot, and one on Shavuot. One is on Sunday, sponsored by the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem. Some very serious Torah study. It will be going through about 4 or 5 hours. You'll get the information on our website and elsewhere. On Shavuot itself, if you're willing to leave your computer on and have the Zoom on, you're going to have an all-night session beginning 9 p.m. on Thursday night, going to 6 a.m. on Friday morning, the first day of Shavuot, with 20 scholars teaching, sponsored by the Rabbinical Assembly. That information will be on our website. You can access that. And
It's recorded.
so wishing all of you a Yom Tov, a good day, and be well, stay strong.
Yes.
And thank you for all
Thank you.
being here. And we will see
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you very much. Everybody stay well.
Everyone be
Thank you so
well.
much.
Have a good day, everybody. Yom Tov.
They have a wonderful day. That's right. Stay healthy.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Can you sell that
Bye.
making to a boy? The one
Goodbye.
that has all the
Bye-bye.
sins? I don't know.